No one noticed in the first minute. Not even on the first day. Death didn't announce that it was gone, it simply stopped happening. I was in a hospital when I saw the first crack in the system of the world. A man was brought in with his chest crushed after a car accident. Doctors rushed, opened his chest, tried to resuscitate a body that, by any known logic, should already have been gone. The monitors showed no heartbeat. There was no breathing. And yet, he did not die. The body did not collapse. There was no final silence that usually follows the end. Hours later, he opened his eyes. That was the moment something began to fracture inside our idea of reality. At first, they called it a miracle. Then, a medical error. After that, an isolated event. But isolated events don't repeat themselves across different continents, on the same day, with the same statistical impossibility. People shot and not dying. Terminal patients who did not cross the final threshold. Fatal accidents that left destroyed bodies, alive, conscious, trapped in an existence that should not continue. The word immortality appeared far too early. And like every misused word, it deceived us. It wasn't eternal life. It was something worse. The first 72 hours were marked by global confusion. Hospitals overflowed not with survivors, but with people who could not die. Doctors lost their parameters. Religions entered theological short circuits. Governments called for calm while understanding absolutely nothing. And then came the moment when everyone realized it at the same time. War stopped. Not because of peace. Because of uselessness. When wounded soldiers remained alive, even without physical conditions, combat lost its meaning. When explosions no longer ended lives, only multiplied injured and conscious bodies, violence stopped being a solution. Horror was no longer death, it was continuation. The entire world began asking the same question, even without saying it out loud: what if this never ends? On the fourth day, they tried to test it. A condemned prisoner was executed. The body burned. The heart stopped. The brain entered electrical silence. Even so, minutes later, vital signs returned. Not as resurrection. As persistence. As if reality itself were preventing the final shutdown. That was the moment panic replaced hope. Because death had not been defeated. It had been disabled. Without explanation. Without warning. Without a manual. Children kept being born. People kept aging. Diseases kept destroying bodies. The only difference was that no one crossed the final limit anymore. Suffering no longer had an ending point. And humanity, which had always lived knowing that everything ends, began to lose its sanity in the face of the idea that nothing ever would. I remember the first honest headline I saw days after the event. It didn't celebrate. It didn't explain. It simply said, "The world no longer knows how to go on." And that was the truth. Because when death stops, every other structure soon begins to collapse. In the first days, we still tried to pretend everything was normal. As if the absence of death were just a technical detail that science would soon solve. People kept going to work, turning on the television, arguing about politics, complaining about traffic. But all of it was theater. A world that cannot die does not function with the same gestures. The collapse began quietly. Hospitals became warehouses of living bodies. People in irreversible conditions, trapped in beds, trapped in pain, trapped within themselves. There were no discharges. No deaths. No releases. Doctors began to resign not from physical exhaustion, but from moral collapse. They were trained to save lives, not to sustain infinite suffering. Families began to break. At first, no one wanted to admit it, but soon it became impossible to hide. Keeping someone alive forever costs more than any society can afford. People started being left at home, and locked rooms, and improvised warehouses. Not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. Compassion has limits when the end disappears. Religions entered an open crisis. If there is no death, where is the final judgment? Where is heaven? Where is hell? Religious leaders split between those who claimed it was a blessing and those who called it a punishment. Churches filled with fear, not faith. People no longer prayed for eternal life, but for the right to rest. Suicides began, and they did not work. This was the point where collective sanity began to collapse. People jumped from buildings, cut their wrists, ingested poisons, set themselves on fire, and remained alive. Bodies destroyed, yet conscious. Pain did not kill. Despair did not free. Death did not answer. The world realized, too late, that death was not the enemy. It was the escape valve. Without it, every trauma became permanent. Every mistake, eternal. Every suffering, infinite. Governments reacted as they always do, with control. Population containment laws were created. Birth became regulated. Having children became a crime in some countries. In others, a privilege granted only to those who could sustain eternity. Life became a resource too dangerous to be freely distributed. Prisons became sentences worse than any ancient execution. Because there was no longer a maximum penalty. There was only continuous punishment. A man sentenced to life in prison was now sentenced, forever. With no release through time. No forgetting. No death. Wars did not return. Not for ethical reasons. For logistical ones. What do you do with millions of wounded soldiers who cannot die? The battlefield became a warehouse of living horrors. Tanks idle, drones abandoned, weapons useless. Violence lost its purpose when it could not end anything. And then came the question no one wanted to ask, but which began to echo in every language. If death no longer exists, what does it mean to be human? People began to change. Not biologically, but emotionally. The fear of death had always shaped choices, loves, risks, urgency. Without it, everything slowed. Became indifferent. Empty. Relationships lost intensity. Promises lost weight. Tomorrow stopped being a threat and became a punishment. I remember the day I understood this clearly. I saw a woman sitting on the floor of a stopped subway station, holding the crushed body of her husband after a fall. He was breathing. His eyes moved. The pain was all there. And she was not crying. She was simply staring, like someone who understood that this would never end. There was no hope in that looked up. There was permanence. And it was then that I understood, the world was not entering a new era. It was trapped in an error. And errors, when they cannot be erased, turn into condemnation. At first, humanity tried to reorganize itself. We always do. It's almost a biological reflex. When everything breaks, we try to build new rules from the shards. Containment centers were created. They were not called hospitals, because there was no cure anymore. They were not prisons either, because there was no specific crime. They were places meant to stabilize bodies. People who could no longer move. People whose pain had become permanent. People who begged, every single day, for something no one could give. The word euthanasia returned to public debate. But it was an empty debate. The method didn't matter, shutting down machines, stopping nutrition, destroying the brain. Nothing worked. The body remained. Consciousness, somehow, persisted. Death wasn't blocked by technology. It simply was no longer available. That gave birth to a new kind of terror, the fear of being injured. Before, the fear was dying. Now, it was surviving the damage. People began to avoid everything. Stairs. Vehicles. Heights. Tools. Sports disappeared. Physical labor became an exception. Every movement started to be calculated, because a mistake could mean eternal pain. A crushed arm didn't heal properly. A destroyed organ didn't regenerate. Suffering accumulated. The cities grew quieter. Not because of peace, but because of caution. Laughter faded. Music became rare. Even arguments lost intensity. No one wanted to waste emotional energy in a world where nothing ended. Relationships became utilitarian. Loving someone meant accepting the risk of watching that person suffer forever. Marriages declined. Birth rates collapsed. Love, which had always been driven by the urgency of time, began to feel irresponsible. And then came the most dangerous phase, adaptation. People began to get used to it. Human beings have the terrifying ability to normalize horror when it becomes constant. Children grew up without ever seeing a funeral. Young people never heard the phrase "until death do us part" as something real. The idea of an ending became a legend, an abstract concept belonging to old books. With that, something essential began to disappear: the value of choice. If everything is eternal, nothing is urgent. If there is no end, there is no final consequence. Crime began to change shape. Not because of greater evil, but because of indifference. Hurting someone no longer carried the weight of death, only the weight of continuous suffering, and over time, that stopped frightening those already emotionally numb. Punishments became symbolic. The legal system collapsed conceptually. How do you judge someone when there is no final sentence? How do you forgive when there is no biological forgetting? And then came the question that split the world in two. It was no longer "why did death stop?" It became "should we bring it back?" Groups began to form. Some believed it was a cosmic error, something that had to be corrected at any cost. Others saw the absence of death as a forced evolution, a new phase of existence. These spoke of total adaptation, modified bodies, conditioned minds, a society built not to live well, but to endure forever. That was the moment science crossed a dangerous line. Not to bring death back, but to bypass it. Research shifted its focus not to healing, but to permanent anesthesia. Pain blocking. Emotional suppression. If dying wasn't possible, maybe not feeling was. The idea spread too fast. Because faced with eternity, feeling less sounded like mercy. And I watched people accept it with relief. Accept losing parts of themselves. Accept silencing emotions. Accept becoming weaker versions, but more bearable ones. That was when I understood something terrifying. Humanity was not being destroyed by the absence of death. It was being slowly reshaped by it. And still, no one knew the most important thing of all. If death had stopped, who or what had done it, and why? The answer did not come as a divine revelation, nor as an official announcement. It emerged in the most human way possible, through error. A collapse in an underground laboratory, one of those centers that had been repurposed after hospitals lost their meaning. A group of physicists and neuroscientists had been working there for years in silence, funded by consortia that no longer represented countries, but interests. They were not trying to bring death back. They were trying to understand what had been removed from the universe. Because, over time, it became clear that it was not the human body that had changed. It was the environment. The first indication was statistical. In quantum simulations, certain events simply stopped occurring. Decays that were once inevitable began to fail. Natural processes of collapse were being delayed. Not interrupted by force, but bypassed, as if the universe were avoiding endpoints. The hypothesis sounded too absurd to be published. Something had imposed a fundamental restriction on reality. A new rule. An invisible clause. Nothing could end. Not even stars, and some models. Not particles, at the deepest scales. Human death was only the most visible symptom of something far greater. As the data began to align, the question no one wanted to voice emerged: this was not an accident, it was a decision. And decisions imply intention. The theory that arose was informally called the continuity protocol. The idea was simple and terrifying. Consciousness, at some point in the universe's development, had become a risk. Not to itself, but to the structure of reality. Intelligent species tend to create collapses, wars, extinctions, deep manipulations of matter. The universe, or something operating within it, had reacted. Not by destroying consciousness, but by preventing it from escaping. Without death, there is no renewal. Without an end, there is no replacement. A consciousness trapped in its own body becomes predictable, contained, stable. A closed system. Humanity was not being punished. It was being contained. This conclusion split the researchers themselves. Some suffered psychological breakdowns upon realizing that eternal life was not a gift, but a cosmological cage. Others felt relief. If death had been removed by a greater force, then fighting it would be useless, perhaps even dangerous. And there was an even worse detail. The blockade was not perfect. In extremely rare cases, under extreme conditions, total destruction of the brain, absolute annihilation of the body, consciousness simply vanished. It did not die. It did not transcend. It was erased. These cases began to be called voids. People who ceased to exist without leaving any trace, residual memory, or perceptible continuity. There was no pain, no report, no return. Only absence. When this became known, something shifted in society. For the first time since death had ended, a new taboo emerged: total erasure. Some began to worship it as liberation. Others saw it as the true hell, not suffering forever, but being nothing. If eternity was already unbearable, absolute nothingness seemed even more terrifying. Groups began to form again. No longer religious, no longer political, but existential. There were those who sought to provoke the void, even without guarantee. There were those who defended protecting the body at all costs, fearing complete disappearance. And there were those who began to suspect that the protocol was not automatic. That perhaps it was being monitored. Because whenever humanity came too close to understanding the mechanism, something failed. Laboratories lost power. Data corrected itself. Researchers entered catatonic states with no physical cause. It was as if the universe itself applied soft corrections, preventing certain questions from being answered fully. It was at this point that the most dangerous idea emerged. What if the protocol could be deactivated? Not for everyone. Not all at once there. But locally. If death had been removed as a containment measure, perhaps it could be restored as an exception. A deliberate error in the system. A breach. Not as collective liberation, but as individual choice. The possibility of choosing the end. This idea was considered scientific heresy, ethical madness, ontological terrorism. But at the same time, it awakened something humanity had lost since the beginning of it all: urgency. For the first time in years, people began to discuss the future again. Not the eternal one, but the limited one. They began to speak of irreversible decisions. They began to feel fear, and along with it, desire. And I realized that, in the middle of a world where nothing ended, the mere idea of a possible end was the most alive thing left. But one answer was still missing. If someone, or something, had imposed the protocol, what would happen if we broke it? The breach was not opened with explosions, nor with protests, nor with public declarations. It was born where everything had begun, in silence, inside a forgotten laboratory, operated by people who no longer believed in salvation, only in choice. The experiment promised no success. There were no guarantees. No complete simulations. All that existed was a hypothesis. If the continuity protocol was a rule imposed upon reality, perhaps it could be violated locally, for brief moments, creating a point where an ending would once again be possible. Not for the entire world. For someone. The first volunteer was neither a martyr nor a fanatic. He was a tired man. A former physician who had spent years caring for bodies that could not die and minds that begged for rest. He signed the consent form with steady hands, not out of courage, but exhaustion. When the field was activated, there was no light and no sound. No visible reaction. Only silence. And then, he was gone. There was no detectable void. No residual anomaly. No sign of persistent consciousness. For the first time in years, something simply ended. The impact was immediate and devastating. The world stopped, not because of failure, But shock. The news spread quickly because people recognized what had happened before they understood how. Someone had died. Truly. Somewhat with relief that. Others fell into absolute panic. Because death, when it returns, brings more than rest. It brings responsibility. Weight. Consequence. Governments attempted to intervene. Groups tried to destroy the laboratory. Others rushed to replicate the experiment. But something curious happened. The protocol reacted. Not with direct violence, but with increasing resistance. Each new attempt required more energy, more precision, more sacrifice. Reality seemed to tolerate exceptions, but reject patterns. As if it accepted choice, but refused mass liberation. That was when humanity understood the final truth. The protocol was never meant to be completely broken. It was meant to be negotiated. Death had not been removed forever. It had been placed behind a locked door, and the key was not technology, nor force, nor faith. It was intention. The conscious choice to end. From that day on, the world changed again. It did not return to what it once was, it never could. But something essential was restored, the sense of time. Living regained weight. Loving became urgent again. Mistakes began to hurt again. Every decision recovered its gravity, because the end became possible once more, not guaranteed, not automatic, but accessible. Few chose to walk through the door. Most chose to continue existing. But knowing that the end could be chosen changed everything. And as for the protocol, it remained. Observing. Adjusting. Allowing. Perhaps as a guardian. Perhaps as a jailer. Perhaps as something that understands better than we do the danger of consciousness without limits. Today, when I look back, I realize the question was never why did death stop? The true question was always something else. What do we do when we are no longer forced to end? The answer, it seems, was not in eternity. It was in choice.